The concept of consent has come to take on tremendous political significance in the 21st century. Political significance it didn't have in the 20th century. I think the use of the concept of consent in the context of date rape has sort of transformed the way people think about the consent of the governed, the role of consent in government as itself, without people really thinking clearly about why that is or how much of anything in government is supposed to work. There was a housing development in a cheap suburb of Toronto that ended up with one really rundown, shabby apartment building over here, inhabited almost entirely by Palestinian refugees, and another apartment building, just as shabby, just as rundown, across the parking lot, that was all Israeli immigrants. And they hated each other cordially. And I remember reading a newspaper article about these two apartment buildings. This kind of contrast, I would say, is more common in London, England, but it was an extraordinary, in exactly the same circumstances that led Palestinians to come and live in this particular neighborhood, in this particular apartment building, led Jewish settlers. We can't use the word settlers, Jewish immigrants, to come and live in the same neighborhood. And they would not consent to have their children go to the same school, right? They would not consent to have their children, perhaps, will differ from family to family, they wouldn't want their children learning the theory of evolution. Neither one of those groups living in those two apartment buildings would consent to study the same curriculum about World War II and the Holocaust. Right? And yet that's exactly what the government wants to do, is to force those two groups of people to go to the same school, for their children to see one another face to face, to challenge the bigotry and ignorance of their own parents, that the children will learn the government's version of biology, including evolution, that they're going to learn the government's version of what happened in World War II. And that may lead to squabbles around the family dinner table. That may lead to real conflicts with their parents, where they say, look, Dad, this is what you told me happened in World War II, and this is what they say at school. All right, and that could be just as much a source of tension within a Jewish Israeli family as it would be within a Palestinian family. But all of these issues probably much more extreme for Muslim immigrants in Canada, struggling with those issues, right? So if you believe in this concept that government cannot do anything without the consent of the governed, right? There's a very real sense in which you don't believe in education, period. There are small towns in Canada. This is probably true everywhere in the world, but let's just talk about Canada, because I know it well. There are small towns where every single individual in that town is a member of a crazy Christian cult group. So crazy is my own editorializing. I'm sure they consider themselves a perfectly sane Christian cult group. Okay? There are all kinds of things they won't consent to. They may not consent to have their children put into schools. They also may not consent to the government coming in and forcing them to obey standard traffic regulations or sewage regulations or what have you. Is it up to the consent of the individual, of the community, even if it's 100% of people in the community, to refuse sewage treatment program? All right. It's not the case that government is something that works primarily or only with the consent of the governed, and then it's only some kind of remarkable exception to the rule or some kind of footnote to history. The government does something contrary to the consent of the government, all right? That kind of coercion is government in principle. Government is precisely the force in our society, the force in our lives, that compels the children of Palestinian people and Israeli people to sit down at the same table in the same classroom and study the same curriculum with the same teacher. And some of them are going to make friends. Some of them are going to come home and shock their parents. Probably there's some Palestinians who end up getting an Israeli girlfriend, or Israelis get a Palestinian boyfriend. Probably there are unexpected friendships that come out of it, and probably unexpected conflicts and rivalry and terrible things, right? The common table being created there through education, right? That is government. And it comes about through coercion. It comes about through directly and flagrantly violating the consent of the people being governed each and every day. Right? Water quality, sewage treatment, compelling apps, taking away everyone's right, everyone's freedom, everyone's privilege. You probably eat 3 times a day. You probably go to the bathroom a lot more often than that. You may not think about your freedom in this relation, okay? This is government. It's not an exception to the rule. It is the rule. It is rule in principle. What I've seen happen in the last 20 years is that more and more this notion of consent, which has a kind of self-evident significance, when you're talking about date rape, when you're talking about romance, when you're talking about personal relationships, it's transformed the way people, both on the left and on the right, think about government. And it could be added, they only think about this when it is convenient for them. Right? On the right wing, the most obvious theater, the most obvious theater for these absurdities to be played out on, to demonstrate themselves on, would be anarcho-capitalists, libertarians, their notion of non-aggression, and that the government should do absolutely nothing without people's consent. On the left-wing fringe, I've heard lately from vegan antinatalists who do not believe you have the right to reproduce, to conceive and give birth to a child, because you don't have the consent of that child to exist before it comes into existence. I kid you not, those people take their political movement very seriously. And, in the middle, or we should say across the whole spectrum, left to right, you have movements towards minarchism, minimalism, even if it's only aesthetic, forms of ecology that have to do with minimizing waste, right? Even just calls for low taxes, civil liberties, and freedoms that are based on minimizing government, right? Less, less, less. Subtract, subtract, subtract. And there's not a lot of thought given to what it is they're subtracting from. And I would note, it really just comes up as a leitmotif. People ask, how dare the government invade Iraq without my permission? And they ask, how dare the government invade Iraq without the Iraqis' permission, too? They do, right? So I think this is a very strange moment for sort of coming of age in Western democracies, of gaining the maturity to really step back with detachment and recognize the coercive and indeed oppressive nature of government. And you've got options. You don't have to embrace this. I really do understand that some people will make the well-informed decision to go and live in a cave, that some people will live in a small wooden hut in the remote wilderness, and they will get to experience what life is like with a minimum of access to government, a minimum of access to government-provided services like hospitals and education and electricity and water and sewage treatment plants. When you put yourself out in that remote wilderness, you'll get to see what life is like under those conditions. An incredibly small number of people will reject the social contract that's offered by government. But the rest of us, I think, have to challenge this consent-centered narrative. All right? People, including people in positions of political power, they don't do good and they don't do evil. They do things. And later on, they find out if those things were right or wrong. Later on, they find out if those things were successful or unsuccessful. It's very easy to forget now that in a city like Toronto or in a city like New York, there was a considerable population of Italians who did not want to go to war with fascist Germany or fascist Italy. Right? They may not have been fascists themselves. They may not have really believed in or supported Mussolini. But you can imagine Italian Americans, Italian Canadians, there was actually a considerable public that was in this sense anti-war, if not openly pro-fascist. And that war went ahead, without their consent. Now, many people in a very shallow way invoke the memory of World War II as if it were a tremendously positive and one-sided thing. World War II, as fought by the United States and Canada, had unbelievable, unforeseen consequences. Unbelievably negative, unforeseen consequences, such as the creation of communist China under the dictatorship of Mao Zedong. Now, absolutely nobody who was sitting down to make that decision, and it is very much a problem with our democracies that a small number of people in a small room made that decision. It's not the case. It's not the case. There was some broad public, plebiscite to determine this, but the people who sat down to make that decision, you can imagine the long list of priorities that they were thinking about and worrying about, including places like Czechoslovakia and Poland and, of course, England and France. Of all the places on the map that they were thinking about, certainly the lowest priority possible would have been China. Certainly, absolutely nobody was thinking about how an alliance against the Nazis with Joseph Stalin was going to impact, their long-term future of China and Japan. If anyone cared, it would have been an unbelievably low priority, even compared to disputing the future of Poland, right? Disputing the future of Greece. There were a lot of different theaters of World War II, a lot of different parts of the map to be drawn. Well, guess what? Creating the dictatorship of Mao Zedong in China murdered more people than the Nazis. As absolutely terrible as the Nazis were, as compelling as the case was to intervene and extinguish, the dictatorship of Adolf Hitler, unbelievably, if you can sit back and look at it with detachment, that ended up killing more innocent people in China than died in the gas chambers of Europe. Right now, I have Jewish heritage. My own relatives, of course, unknown to me and my generation, were killed. Of course, if one could go back and rewrite history, there are many changes you want to make, all right? But I'm not a racist, okay? I can't sit here and tell you that a Jewish life is worth more than a Chinese life. That would be deeply hypocritical and deeply racist for me, all right? And this should be obvious. Ask yourself, have you ever heard anyone reflect on this in any high school history classroom, university history classroom, any textbook you've ever seen, any newspaper? What I've just said to you, sadly, strangely, in the 21st century, it remains unthinkable. It remains unthinkable to question how these decisions are made, what the consequences were. And this is a kind of index of just how little democracy we have. You can read the heartbreaking story of what happened in the Peloponnesian War in Thucydides. So this is talking about ancient Athens and the way decisions were made about wars at that time. People seem to remember Sparta as being the opposite of democracy, whereas Athens supposedly represents democracy. Let me tell you, you get a detailed description of how Sparta voted on whether or not to go to war. All the people, so they had a room full of people, and all the people who supported the war walked over to one wall, and all the people who were against the war walked to the other, and they counted how many people were standing on each side of the room. Well, Sparta was a lot more democratic than Canada was, the United States was in the lead up to World War II, right? There's a lot more to be said about that, all right? The notion of whether or not anyone consented to go to war in World War II, the notion of whether or not anyone had any meaningful consent before Canada decided to bankrupt itself building a railroad, before the United States decided to bankrupt itself putting a man on the moon, any of the things, however grand in scale, however really unimaginable in terms of the millions and billions of dollars in the budget, or however tiny but really transforming your life, like forcing you to go to that school or going into that Christian religious community and saying, no, we're going to drag you into the modern world, along with the sewage treatment plants and traffic lights and forcing your kids to go to school with everyone. Like, whatever. Some of these things have budgets in the billions and are difficult to conceptualize, like putting a man on the moon or building nuclear weapons or starting a war, an enormous war, entering into a war like World War II. Some of them are boggling in their scale, and some of them are so tiny, right? But this is government, all right? Government, it's so radically incompatible, so fundamentally, profoundly incompatible with this concept of consent that, as I say, is this unexamined loan word that's come over from the world of romance and dating into, party politics. It's not the case that government is something that primarily and most of the time is flowing along with public consent. And then just once in a while, as a footnote, as an exception to the rule, is contrary to the consent of the government. No, government is very much integrally and by definition something oppressive, something coercive, something that's happening contrary to your consent absolutely all of the time. Every time you turn on the tap, every time you flush the toilet, and it is that government that's burdened you with the whole vocabulary of politics that you've inherited, examined or unexamined, from your primary school, high school textbooks, so on and so forth. Whatever it is you think you know about politics, probably 80% of it growing up came from propaganda. The questions you've been taught to ask, the questions you were told never to ask. You had the freedom to raise your hand in the classroom, but do you know what happened if you dared to ask the wrong question, right? Yeah, you learn to ask questions in school. You also learn to remain in silence. You learn that you'll be scolded if you dare to ask anything unthinkable. If you dare to ask, but isn't it the case that Mao Zedong killed more people than Adolf Hitler? Isn't it the case that Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin both were our allies, were on our side, that we fought for them and they fought for us in this same war that you're presenting to me as this entirely heroic narrative? If you dare to ask those questions, some of you may have as children. Some of you may have had the experience of asking your teachers. Some of you may have had the experience of asking your parents. And you may know the outcomes. And in all kinds of ways, this coercion, this oppression, it does shape who we are. It does shape how we live. It does shape how we think, most of all in terms of the things that are unthinkable, the questions that we don't even think to ask. And I say this to you not because I'm an anarchist, quite the contrary, because I think we now need to take this next step in the 21st century, a step away from, frankly, the whole liberal utilitarian tradition that defined our way of thinking about government as less, 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 that defined progress as the creation of limited government, a limit on the tyranny that supposedly existed before.